I'm already a bit too tired. We move, ladies and gentlemen, we move to the next topic, and that topic is the sources. So similar as the last two topics, it's the same proposition, that the understanding of the phenomena of legal argumentation helps selecting relevant sources and evidence. And we move now to this sources and evidence, and it's a category in the assessment form, and it's basically the question: how many, how relevant, how authoritative, and did you assess them? And those are the three questions that, or the end result that determine the overall impression. And the amount is not often the issue. So most of you are pretty capable of producing 200 footnotes equals 200 sort of references. So that is not the main issue. But where the complications start, and where the intelligence test most dramatically hits in, is in the relevance domain. And the thing is that in legal reasoning, so the purely legal reasoning, there is a very strict hierarchy. I always refer to the Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, where there's a sort of ranking in the European Union Court has a sort of regulation where they indicate a similar sort of recognized sources of law, as in treaties and custom and case law and doctrine and the like. And that means that most sources are, no, let's start with the object being legal rules. Talking about the object being legal rules, then the source you refer to should be aligned in this hierarchy, and you should look for the highest source. And that means that if you write about Article 999 of the GDPR, the footnote should not be law firm in the south edges of Hong Kong on the 7th floor, who happens to have a understandable website with some explanations about Article 999 of the GDPR. So it sounds silly, but still, and it sounds very bachelor-like in terms of theme, but it's a sort of heads up for you. And then when you look at the more doctrinal sources, so the scholarly articles, then the idea is that each of them is assessed by you in terms of quality. And the most hysterical version of that is that you indicate in your argumentation, in your storyline, that the source is having a certain rating. It's not the tradition in legal scholarship, so we're not doing that, but the real sciences are doing the same trick, and then they have all kinds of codes and other indications with which they indicate what the ranking is of the journal they base themselves on. And then it's a sort of mathematical thingy that you can calculate the value of the article on the basis on the value of the sources in mathematical terms. And I think we should put that on our agenda as legal scholars. I guess that my colleagues will freak out when you actually start indicating the ranking. But it's more a sort of matter of thinking that in the early stages, you are going to make a hierarchy list of kings, dukes, earls, barons, knights in the sources. And you put them in that order. And basically, with each source, you try to find a piece of legislation, a case law, piece of case law, a handbook, a top gear journal article, and a report of the European Commission and of a think tank. And so ideally, each footnote contains all 6 levels. How does it work in practice? You start with the website of this lovely law firm in Hong Kong, downtown, 11th floor, who mentions something of interest, and then you go in the reverse until you reach the high hierarchy sources, etc. And so it's not a matter of doing your research in that way, but I'm talking about the end result. The sources, more theoretically, are obviously connected to lecture number 2, where we discussed research or scholarship. Sources in LLM theses are basically the data, the evidence in the eyes of the other scholars. And in that sense, a piece of legislation is already an empirical fact. Although there's a debate going on that claim, but technically speaking, that is something you find. And then we have the strangest tradition ever, that we refer to pieces of legislation with an abbreviation, without dates, without the spots where you can find it. And that's this territory thingy. So in a national context, you refer to the Civil Code of the Netherlands with Civil Code, dot. And not the law enacting rules and obligations for private individuals of the year 1848, promulgated by the State Gazette in edition number 14. Because you're in that territory bubble. But you are all over the place. And that means that you will engage with your supervisor how far this should be taken. For instance, in your literature list or bibliography, whether there is or is not a category on legislation. The funny thing is that we have less confusion where it comes to case law. There we have a tradition to give full references. But the intriguing thing is that most of you touch upon the European Convention on Human Rights, and in 99% of all the theses I saw, there was not a reference to that in the proper spot. As if a natural scientist who studies red and blue mouses in a laboratory forgets to mention that he was looking at red and blue mouses in his data collection. That would be perceived as very odd, to write about blue and red mouses and not mention them. Secondly, the sources are the main component of the concept of truth. So the whole idea of scholarship is that you present to society the truth. Truth claims. Argumentation results in truth claims. And we perceive truth as a combination of a reasoning part and a factual part. And the funny thing in our industry is that our sources are quite often both, especially doctrine. Because doctrine is a sort of example of reasoning. And then you get a sort of a Matryoshka puppet effect. that the source is sort of factual thing and a reasoning in itself. And I invite you to make that explicit. The factual side of scholarly writing is it's a fact that there's a debate going on topic ABC. That's an empirical statement. There, scholarly literature, doctrine is a piece of evidence as in the empirical sense of the word. And then, when you start reasoning, and in that sense refer to colleagues, then you say, my reasoning is derived or mirrored or inspired by the reasoning of that and that colleague. So I call upon you to make in your word choice explicit how you use the sources and the evidence. Because that each time differs. Thirdly, those sources are 100% part of the rhetoric, last week's topic. As in, that the more sources you present, the more trustworthy you are as a researcher. So that is big time the ethos part. Look at me, my bibliography is 10 pages, I must speak the truth. And last but not least, this sources all connect to the grocery list of my taxonomy. So you have sources pertaining to the object legal rule, sources to object actor, sources to issue, you have sources to national territories, regional territories, international territories, you have sources in terms of the audience, in terms of the position, maybe not the species. And in terms of legal argumentation, the topic of tonight, the level can be expressed with the sources. So your footnotes and your bibliography are a storyline in itself. One of the requirements of your proposal in January is that you give a preliminary literature list. And if already in that preliminary list you manage to create a nice balance and leave out the www sources, and then you already win your first match. Because one way of looking at those proposals is that we look at the bibliography, and if we recognize a storyline in it and authority, then you get a go. Because that is the goal of deliverable number 1, to get a go. And then 2.5 credits. Talking about bottom line, okay? And so work on that. So that is not let's put it differently. None of your research questions will survive until the 1st of July. So actually we're sort of skipping that. I will cut it out of the recording. So we look at 3 sentences in terms of language, you look at the bibliography, and then we hope that you will see the light somewhere in May. And then you get to go. So in terms of time investment, look at that and look at the outline we will discuss during the tutorials. Not necessarily the research question alone. And then let's do it more systematically, that I mention 4 categories, so another grocery list. And the element I want to emphasize, on top of what I already said, is that from a research perspective, the sources could also be perceived as the first word of the 3 words replicability, reliability, and validity, as being the overarching words of your research project. And the sources have, on top of all the functions we already mentioned, also the function of replicability. The theory is that if you delete your text and leave your footnotes and bibliography and the research question, that other researchers will find the same conclusion as you did, which is a hysterical theory in our domain. But in trying to be scholarly, we cannot pick and choose. And this is one of the holy grails in science, replicability. So it's our sort of duty to do our utmost to simulate it. So that is a very important component. Well, I mentioned already the truth claim. So it is the supporting of your claim. And there is this debate with the concept of your own opinion. We touched upon that earlier, and we will repeat that in the tutorials. So the line of reasoning is your originality, but the reasons itself and the sources are not your originality. And that is why I dare to say that if you have one sentence without proof, it's an invalid sentence. And obviously I exaggerate it a little bit. But ideally, you put your text in a 90-degree washing machine. I don't know whether you know what happens with wool. If you put it in 90 degrees, it shrinks. So the idea is that you put your text in the washing machine at 90 degrees Celsius, and that only those sentences remain and survive that have a footnote, or reference, or evidence. And it has two effects. One, that you look very seriously at every sentence. And secondly, that when you gather evidence, sources, you already think of the sentence that comes with it. And basically you could write your thesis in Excel with 2 columns. One sentence, one evidence. Ethos, I already mentioned. If you're lucky, your supervisor has written about a topic related to your topic. And in terms of rhetoric, my tip, cite your supervisor. And I don't know whether that is an ethos or pathos. Probably both. But, well, we always have sort of second thoughts about the word rhetoric and sort of negative connotation. And I put it on the screen even. Look at me, how many sources I can get. But that is sort of underlying reality. And that means that you should especially pay attention in your main courses right now, which sources are used over there, and which footnotes are there in the reading you have to do, and try to make a sort of Christmas tree in terms of hierarchy of those sources. Because most likely, you will, in your thesis, touch upon sort of regulatory thingies in Europe, and definitely, most likely, talking about rule of law thingies of next quarter. And I don't exclude that a little portion of law enforcement and consumer protection will be in your thesis. And so you already have a sort of treasury box in those courses, and I didn't mention the tool. Maybe we will do in the tutorials, but I use Zotero to collect all those data with lovely plugins for Word, and you can make notes and bibliographies and name it. Pretty brilliant. But we will talk about that when needed. You're master after all. In the tutorial. Last aspect is legal argument aspect. There is a sort of ID that continental jurists do not think, but that they are just the mouth of the law, which is an English translation of a French saying, claiming that French judges in the last 300 years did not make law, which is not true, but that is how, in terms of sociology, that community wants it to be. Parliament makes law, judges just apply. And the funny thing is that in the common law countries, there's a sort of claim that it is the other way around, although those judges just claim that they find the law and just express it in words, which basically is sort of the same, in my view, but that's another topic. The thing I want to say right now is that we have a very long tradition, that we are very modest, that we do not present ourselves as innovators and changers, that we say, dear society, I found this law, and this is the legal consequence. And that's especially in the object rules, and the part that is case solving, so the forensic part in your LLM thesis, there you should be very strict in that tradition. And then you need the territoriality aspect to know what the flavors are, whether it is Brusselish or national or international, whatever you want to talk. But the bottom line is that you need the highest legal authorities available. And if you end up with lower courts, then you have to add that there are no higher court judgments available and traditions like that. So please apply that in your thesis. So the interim conclusion is that the sources are having four sort of functions, and that in technical terms you can match the taxonomy of the 6 ingredients or components of legal argumentation with 6 sets of sources. And again, make an Excel sheet or another tool, and that you actually check whether that is the case. And most of you do not find sources necessary on the actors or on the opposing parties, etc., etc., where I think they are available. And so if you are talking about consumers, then make a footnote. European Statistical Bureau, there are almost 500 billion consumers. Number, date, data, evident. So don't take anything for granted. So make sure that all those components are supported by the corresponding topics. And last but not least, last topic, the structure, with the same claim that talking about the legal argumentation and this taxonomy could influence the structure. In the assessment form, it's called the order, the coherence, and the conclusion. Funny bullet points in my eyes, but the idea is that you have a good structure. And it relates to the assessment form, to research traditions, to rhetoric again, and to legal argumentation. Technically speaking, any structure goes, as long as you have one, according to the assessment form. Because the claim or the request is, please have a structure. And if you can argue that it's a coherent structure when you have the research question at the end, that's then coherent. And so those bullet points do not say that it should be on a specific point. But then we have a very strong influence of research traditions. And that is a variety of introduction, main part, conclusion, etc., etc. And then I think that the categories on this slide are sort of safe backbone. That you have sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 chapters. In the first chapter, you describe the research question, the methods, and the overview. And then sort of tradition that maybe 3 arguments would be enough. And then that is sort of the argument on the spectrum somewhere halfway. So a factual storyline, a case-solving storyline, and a value storyline, if that is then counting as an argument on the spectrum. And that if you have 3 of those in total, and that would be then enough. 1 sort of argument for your point seems to be too little, and 15 seems to be too much. And then, in most cases, those 3 arguments are then each time a chapter, with opening sentences like, we move now to the next argument in an attempt to answer the research question or language of that flavor. And then, 2.4, you need to answer the research question in the body of your total text. Because that's a tradition. Secondly, one idea of conclusions is that nothing new happens in the conclusion. Because one way of rephrasing introduction, main part, and conclusion is that in the introduction you tell what you're going to tell, in the main part you tell what you tell, and in the conclusion you tell what you told. Making any new ingredients a no-go in that last chapter. Meaning that prior to that last chapter, you have to have answered your research question. Which is not the same tradition in all your previous programs or countries. So there are countries that vehemently disagree with this and say, no, the answer to your research question should be in the conclusion. I don't care, as long as you align with your supervisor. But in terms of logic, and in terms of how Aristotle started an intellectual debate on structure, I think that this is more logical than putting the answers to your research question in the conclusion. And then you should try to convey those 3 components of Aristotle's rhetoric in terms of ethos, logos, and pathos in an efficient way. And I think, starting with your deliverable number 1, the proposal, that the introduction should address the anxieties of the supervisor, chapter pathos. So a bullet point called feasibility of your research question is part of pathos. It is an attempt to communicate with us, I will manage. I will be done by the 1st of July. Why are we anxious? We want to go on vacation on the 2nd of July. So that's a real thing, you know? So try to address that explicitly. Another anxiety is that you have beautiful ideas and dreams, but not a sort of idea where you can find the sources. So take away that anxiety in the proposal and throw at us those sources already. Which means that in December, January, you have to sort of parallel to the main courses, do a sort of research? Well, we have a whole grocery list of legal arguments with 6 components and maybe more. So maybe you take one of those components and make sure that that is sort of rich in terms of IDs, sources, etc. And then in the proposal you say the rest will be done similarly. So we're not asking you to have your thesis done by February, but that you somehow show I can do the trick. And then in terms of structure, the part where the object is a rule, that should follow basic case solving structures. And one I introduced earlier is called IRAC, Issue, Rule, Application, Conclusion, which is the way they do it in American law school, but I claim in European law school we do the same. And what I quite often experience is that students doing theses have great lists of substantive courses, but in the thesis are all over the place where it comes to solving a little case. They create it themselves. So I just ask, have the same rigor you do in your exam on EU regulation. In terms that you identify the issue, the legal facts, the questions, the applicable rules, the elements of the rules, and then what legal consequences could result of that thing. And the key is that you create an implicit case in your thesis. 10% makes it explicit, 90% leaves it implicit. So do me a favor, somewhere down the line in your structure you have a substructure in the chapter on the legal argument, which sounds like I identify an issue and these are the rules and these are the elements and I apply them, etc. So don't think that this is anything else than any exam you have or had in the past. Last but not least, other issues. I would like to repeat the claim that this is a role play. You play legal scholar, so act accordingly. And connected to that is a topic which we try to cover with the Utrecht University Code of Ethics, which is not the whole story, but it's sort of the first chapter of the idea that playing that role or being a legal scholar comes with obligations. And that is a sort of social contract with society, that we should speak the truth and be replicable, reliable and valid, and all the other topics of the last 3 weeks. And then there's one minor theme within that chapter, and that is called plagiarism, where quite often, if we are not stopped by you, we can talk about for hours, and then all of a sudden you are sort of in panic. As in, I write down European Union, should I send money to the EU for copyrights or so? So I want to frame it in a no panic setting. You write your own text, full stop. So no repetition of words of courts or legislators or other authors. You only paraphrase as a tip. And you do not copy work of others. And each sentence has a footnote. So there's no reason that we will ever discuss the P words again. For me, it's a completely uninteresting topic. But it exists, and we have all kinds of control mechanisms who do not work, because then they check your draft, and then they say, well, it's 100% the same as the draft, and other IT issues. But know that it's a sort of nerve in our community. Why? Because we do have professors who missed this class and built their career on plagiarized topics, and then they're kicked out, and then we get less subsidy. And so it is an open nerve in our community. So it's not nothing, but I don't know people of 23 in a master program who want to reach the end goal with copying of a colleague, and if they exist, they are not in this room because you took the effort to listen to me for 4 lectures, so you're the least likely to be ever confronted with this topic. But it exists, and you have to, well, take care of that. And then last but not least, we are getting there, we have a schedule for the tutorials, and the bad news for the students at home is that it's mandatory and on campus and at 9 o'clock. Not always, but most of them. So be prepared to take the flight from New York, where you are now, and say goodbye to your people you live with for those weeks. There will, and these time slots, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, were the only ones available in your schedule, because your main courses are on the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday afternoon, and the Thursday and Friday mornings, leaving no room for scheduling these tutorials on those days. So this is the reason that this is the schedule. Then we will have 8 groups of 12.5 students on average. And I have to make up my mind whether I take the current groups and cut them in 2. Then you see familiar faces, or follow the other option, being that I make random new groups. And both have arguments pro and contra. No neutrality, because you need to be in a group. And that will be announced soon. And if you have urgent obstacles on certain dates, as in that on Monday you are always in Casablanca, then I don't stop you sending me an email, because randomness can be influenced, because it's a human-driven randomness. No promises, but let's see what we can do. And the idea is that we have 4 concrete, condensed sessions where you start talking. So in the first one, we make around 12.5 students asking what would be your research question, a little exercise. Room for reflection on the theorizing lectures. Then the second one, we will make a mock proposal, as in a project plan. Just to get you used to that industry of researchers who make plans in order, I mentioned that in week 2, to get subsidy for their project. With title page, and this is a proposal, and stuff like that. Your name, little things. I still get documents from students who do their 3rd master, where on the document there's no name, in the file name there's no name. It's called document, and the email is a sort of luckymaster@hotmail.com, which makes my life very difficult. So that is number 2. Number 3 is a real proposal with your actual research question, and you will give feedback to each other. And the 4th one is with your supervisor, somewhere, end of January, early February, where you will present your preliminary one to that supervisor. Maybe not all of them, but half of the group. And then the other half will know, okay, I know what I need to do. And then you make your final proposal, which is then in February. So that is ahead of us. I think we concluded a large portion of theorizing. We hit concrete things like assessment forums. We went up to philosophy of science. We tried to frame legal scholarship, and today we try to get our heads around the concept of legal argumentation with all kinds of definitions, broad sense, not broad sense, synonyms with methods, and we tried to translate that to a grocery list, to ingredients of your research question, to selection tool of your sources, and a component of the structure. And I do hope that on the basis of these theories we can make wonderful research projects. And the good news is that as of now we move to more the content, to your topics. There will be a supervisor event somewhere at the end of December where we will have, with some drinks, the opportunity to chat with supervisors, to test topics and personalities and stuff like that, sort of dating, supervisor, Tinder. And yeah, the hope is that you will have a very comfortable period 4, because that is the ultimate period where you do the research and the writing. And the hope is that all those preparatory steps improve that experience, and last but not least, your final grade and 15 credit points. Thank you for your attention. See you in December.